Hi there, my name's Ella Whelan from the Academy of Ideas and the Battle of Ideas Festival. Just a quick message from me to ask you to consider making a donation to the Academy of Ideas. The event that you're about to watch and all of the public events we've held and the recordings that are now on YouTube and SoundCloud are free and open to the public, and we want to keep it that way during this lockdown period. But that means that we need your help. Anything big or small goes towards the team who haven't been furloughed and have been working throughout this period in order to help us keep putting on the kind of public events that keep alive intellectual curiosity through these strange times. The link is below, academyofideas.org.uk/donate, and any support is greatly appreciated. Now, I'll leave you to watch the rest of the recording. First, I'd like to introduce myself. Hello, everyone. I'm Ella Whelan. I work with the Academy of Ideas, and I was the co-convener for the Battle of Ideas Festival in 2019, along with Alistair Donald, my co-host. And really delighted to be chairing this event tonight, from Minneapolis to Hyde Park or Parliament Square or Tooting or Watford or all these places that these protests have been happening. What does the killing of George Floyd mean for British society, British politics, for us who are not out on the streets or watching from home in America? What does this mean from a UK perspective? And, you know, this is cards on the table, this is a difficult debate, and it's something that's been incredibly heated for obvious reasons, not least because of the brutal way in which George Floyd died and the sort of spectacle of us all watching that. But also because, as many people pointed out, this wasn't, for many people, a shocking event. It's something that's happened a lot, in not just in recent history in America, but has been happening for a long time in terms of police brutality against Black men, racism in America, and the tensions are running incredibly high. So protests turned into riots, turned into looting, turned into statue toppling. There's so much has happened in the space of a week. It's been difficult to keep up. And a lot within that debate, there's a strain of thought that argues that white people should shut up and sit down, educate themselves, take themselves out of the conversation, and allow Black people to lead the discussion around racism. There have been criticisms of that. The very interesting thing has been the role of Black Lives Matter, both as an organising force and also as an organisation that's been occasionally absent. So in relation to some of the UK protests, because of the nature of lockdown, Black Lives Matter took a position of not officially calling demos, which led to this quite interesting situation in which the Parliament Square demo, if any of you were there, I was there, had a different kind of vibe to it. It felt very homemade. There was lots of cardboard signs and young people with loudtailers saying, you know, making speeches in different pockets of around Westminster. So this is a complicated picture. And while we're taking it from a UK perspective, of course, some of our speakers are going to want to mention and reference what's going in the US. I know that we have some people in the audience who are American, and we'd very much like to hear your point of view as well. But really the question we want to get to is things like, is America and Britain the same when it comes to racism? Can there be equivalences drawn there, or is the history different? Is the politics different? Is racism is it present in terms of systematic oppression, as some people argue, or is it more specific? And, you know, if it's not too much to ask, quite crucially, how do you deal with all of this if you are someone who thinks that racism a problem and should be fought back against? If you are a genuine anti-racist, what do we do next? So thankfully it's not me whittering on to try and give some answers to these, but I have an expert panel of Battle of Ideas speakers who have been with us through the years of our festival and have spoken on many, many different subjects, but tonight are going to come to you to give their thoughts on this UK's perspective of the whole debate around George Floyd and the aftermath of his death. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that they speak, and then we'll hear from them for about 3 to 5 minutes, short introductions, and then we'll head straight back out to you guys from the floor in true Battle of Ideas, Academy of Ideas, public debate styles. The only very formal thing I'll say before we begin is that I think you'll notice that I have rather forcibly muted everyone, which isn't me being authoritarian, although maybe slightly, but it is just practically in terms of the size of this debate and the way in which it runs. If you sort of let me be authoritarian on the controls and unmute you when's necessary to bring you in, that will work best. So what I'm basically saying is hands off the buttons, everyone. I've got this, though that might be famous last words. So now I'm going to introduce my speakers. And the first person who's going to speak tonight is Patrick Vernon OBE, who is a social commentator, founder of 100 Great Black Britons and creator of the Every Generation game, the Windrush edition. And that's obviously something that's very important right now. I don't know if anyone watched the documentary last night detailing one of the instances of someone who was penalised under that hostile environment. Patrick, since 2010, has been leading the campaign for Windrush Day, and in 2018 kick-started the campaign for an amnesty for the Windrush generation as part of the scandal, and his actions led to a U-turn in immigration policy and the resignation of Amber Rudd as Home Secretary. So he has a huge amount of knowledge in that area and has campaigned for a long time on that, and we're very happy to have Patrick here tonight. Next up is going to be Inaya Folarin Iman, who is the co-director of the Free Speech Union, former project manager of Index on Censorship, and former Brexit Party parliamentary candidate in the last election. And Inaya writes extensively on freedom of speech. She's actually written a piece recently on this very subject, and looks at the kind of issues that inform this debate around what you can and can't say about the protests, what you can and can't say about racism, and the way in which freedom of speech plays a very important role in this debate. So welcome, Inaya. Next up, we have Dr. Shahar Ali, who is the Home Affairs spokesperson and former deputy leader of the Green Party and author of Why Vote Green 2015. In 2015. And for many years, Shahar has been a prominent and outspoken campaigner for civil liberties against the consequences of flawed policy, from the detention of UK residents in Guantanamo and the fatal shooting of de Menezes to the Islamophobic effects of the PREVENT programme and irreconcilability of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism with free speech on Israel. So again, someone who has extensive knowledge in terms of the debates around freedom of speech on this issue and the ways in which racism plays out in other debates, particularly in relation to PREVENT and the kind of screening that entails. Next up, we have Kunle Olulode, who's the director of Voice for Change England, a former creative director of Reebok Productions, and a member of the African Odyssey Programming Board for the BFI. And Voice for Change England is a BME charity and a support body. Its members number over 400 Black community organisations and charities, covering everything from criminal justice to migrant rights. Kunle says that he believes it's time to develop a new narrative around race equality away from deficit models. And for many years, he's talked about the issue of racism and race at the Battle of Ideas, and is also someone who's very involved in music and has DJ'd a few times with some of our events. So he's a man of many talents. So welcome to Kunle. Last but not least is Dr. Cheryl Hudson, who's a lecturer in US political history at the University of Liverpool and co-editor of Why Academic Freedom Matters, which was published in 2016, and Ronald Reagan and the 1980s, which was published in 2008. She was on Sky News this morning talking about this very issue, and she works a lot in terms of publishing. She's published in the Journal of American Studies, the European Journal of American Culture, and many others. So Cheryl is as of this morning, has been talking about this. So we thank her for continuing to talk about it into the evening with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to the speakers and they'll forgive me for interrupting them rudely if they run over the time that we've agreed, and then it'll be straight out to you guys. So without further ado, Patrick, over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's really fantastic to be on this Zoom call and be involved with the fraternity of Battle of Ideas as well. So obviously what happened in America, and obviously today is quite important. We've had the kind of the burial of George Floyd in America, in his hometown in Houston, Texas as well. And obviously the reverberations, it's not the first time we've had reverberations, because you have to go back to the 1960s when we had a civil rights movement in America and the Black Power movement in America, and that led to civil rights. And one particular moment in time, which I think I'd like to remind people, is when Martin Luther King He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1965. He was traveling to Oslo to pick up his award, but he made a stop off. He stopped off in London, central London, in a hotel in Bloomsbury, and he met a number of white, Asian, and African Caribbean activists who had the opportunity to have a private conversation with him, and they picked his brains. They said, what can we do in Britain to fight the issue of racial justice and racial inequality and the colour bar in Britain? He gave them advice and inspired them, and that led to an organisation called the Campaign for Racial Discrimination, or CARD, it was abbreviated. That organisation of white lawyers, people who understood at that stage in the 60s about white privilege, Asian activists, and one particular woman who sadly passed away this year, Dame Jocelyn Barrow. She passed away at the age of 91. A young activist, someone from Trinidad, so was a school teacher, and they formed this organisation which played a key role in shaping and influencing the 1965 Race Relations Act, and then later on the 1968 Race Relations Act. Dame Jocelyn Barrow became the first black woman to be a governor, and she's paved the way for tens of thousands of black people in Britain around campaigning and raising issues around Black Lives Matter. So in the 60s, we had our journey, which is similar to, different from the journey from America, but we had our own civil rights journey. It may not be as glamorous or sexy, where I have a dream outside White House, where hundreds of thousands of people, but we had our own history of civil rights through legislation and policy change. But that history actually goes far back as 2,000 years. The likes of Septimus Severus, one of the nearest person that we're going to have, to be quite honest, to a black prime minister, who's a Roman emperor. He was actually based in York, and his remains are still in York Cathedral. And his job was to rebuild Adrian's Wall and to keep the Scottish at bay, the Celts at bay from coming over the borders, basically. And that is a long history. And then if you roll the history another 1,000 years forward, you got the likes of Olulode Equiano, born in Nigeria, or Benin state, as we now know it. And basically, he was captured as a young boy, taken to America, but he was able to pay for his own freedom, come to Britain, and then he started the campaign around abolition. Often the history and the media focus on William Wilberforce, but actually it was Equiano who wrote a bestseller about his memoirs, and there were other activists and other people during that time doing the same thing as well. So we've had a long history of Black Lives Matter. In many ways, Equiano is the grandfather or the great-grandfather of our own civil rights movement in America. And that is the difference between us and America. We've been here over 2,000 years, even though obviously more of us came post-Second World War, and obviously the history of the Women's generation, compared to the history of America. I remember modern day racism and segregation and all the elements and all the apparatus was developed in Britain, and we exported to America. Remember, America was a colony of Britain until we had a Boston Tea Party, and where they declared self-independence. But the umbilical cord between America and us is a transatlantic slave trade. Britain profited, made its money, and America profited and made its money. And that is the foundation, and that's the umbilical cord between the African-American civil rights movement and our civil rights movement here in Britain, because we have the same common enemies or destinies of imperialism in America and USA. And that has been the link for many, many centuries in many ways. And ironically, a lot of African Americans used to come to Britain to write their memoirs. Phyllis Wheatley is a good example. She had to come to Britain to tell her story, how she was enslaved in the plantations in the deep south of America. The railroad system of Harriet Tubman, we had similar systems here in the UK as well. So there you have the umbilical cord, as well as the modern day issues around the prison chain line, pipeline scenario. And that's why I think a lot of black people in Britain identify what happened to George Floyd in America. There's a commonality of our African heritage, that all of us were taken away from Africa. All of us were abused and were exploited because of the slave trade. You had Jim Crow in America. We had the colour bar here in Britain. So, and these are the similarities and comparisons. And maybe if we had plantations, sugar plantations in London or in Cornwall or in West Midlands or Northumberland, then maybe white people in Britain might understand and appreciate the history of colonisation and empire. So when something like the
last minute, Patrick,
the Colston statue is removed, despite the fact there's been a long historical process and dialogue with people Bristol to this talk about this kind of controversial figure, I saw it as a main. I saw it. I compared that to the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. That Berlin Wall came down was a symbol of fighting communism, ending communism in Eastern Germany. And what we need to do in Britain is have a similar process where we end structural racism and discrimination, particularly for people of African descent.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm afraid we usually would clap, but it's relatively impossible to do that on Zoom. So imagine a virtual clapping for that. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah. Right, next up we have Inaya. So I'm going to unmute you.
I agree with a lot of what has already been said in terms of the kind of historical kind of cross-cultural fertilization between the situation and context in America and the one in Britain. And I kind of support a kind of continuation of that historical radicalism. But I think that what we're seeing in this instance is not exactly in line with that particular tradition that's being described. And to kind of answer the question specifically in terms of what does George Floyd's killing mean for British society, I think it really depends on how we transform the somewhat legitimate grievances that have been expressed in this movement into a coherent, proper political program that can be interrogated and debated. What I've been really concerned about, and that's kind of what I've been writing about, is the homogenization narrative and the kind of exportation of the American racial culture wars and using that to blanket a particular narrative of what it means to be Black in the UK. So for example, we've seen kind of people saying hands up, don't shoot in front of a relatively demilitarized police in the UK. And I think that there is a really big danger if we overemphasize this kind of narrative of white privilege, structural racism, victimization and oppression of the Black experience. I think that we are actually sending a kind of deeply, deeply demoralizing message to what I've said before, is a young generation of Black people, including myself, that are growing up in a society that I think has genuinely made leaps and bounds when it comes to race relations. And I think that we really have to put things into perspective. And on top of that, in terms of the culture wars point, I think that's really important because I think that a lot of what we're seeing is an extension of a kind of pre-existing movement that uses tactics of kind of mob rule, shaming, and very divisive tactics in order to affect political change. And I think that that's really dangerous and has the potential to actually be more divisive and roll back race relations in terms of the breakdown of political debate and discussion about these really important issues. And yes, there is still racism that persists in this country. But as I've already said, I think that we both have to have perspective, but also nuance in terms of there are various different issues that are affecting even different parts of the Black community in terms of like Black African, people of Black African heritage and people of Black Caribbean heritage. There are significant disparities there. So what I would like to see going forward is not only kind of making these really grand statements about the nature of British society in this really negative way. I would like to see much more platforming of a wide range of diverse voices, intellectually and ideologically diverse Black voices, constructing a coherent political program, as we do with any movement, as we saw with Brexit and other movements that have affected change in this country. We need specific ideas, policies that can be debated, interrogated in a democratic way, not this, what I personally believe is this quite divisive politics of kind of ripping things down, censorship, and these kind of simplistic narratives that don't really address the nuances and complexities that I think can actually be responded to in particular.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Inaya, for those opening thoughts. Right, on to Shahar now, who I'm going to unmute. Shahar, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ella. And many thanks for the invitation and everything that your organisation does. In fact, it could hardly be more important that we discuss a topic like this, because I feel as though racism, it often is brushed under the carpet. And of course, indeed, that is one of the problems. And what we see right now, not just on the streets, but on social media, is a kind of divisiveness. Clearly, people taking sides, some sides of which they may already have decided upon. And as if by a process of confirmation bias, two groups, two sides even, can be looking at the same data, the same scene, and drawing radically different conclusions. And that's why I really do believe in your ethos of the organization in terms of free speech and the utility of that. So in this short introduction, I just want to sort of cover very briefly sort of three main points. So what is the problem? Who has ownership of the problem? And what is the process? Firstly, what is the problem? And it feels actually that there is a lot of solidarity and agreement about what that problem is. We can argue about what progress has been made in British society around racism. And indeed there has. But has there been enough? Do we need to go further? Do we need to go faster? Yes, we do. And so this moment in 21st century British politics and internationally is actually quite unique. It's quite pivotal. We don't know whether this is just going to be flash in the pan stuff, but what is extraordinary is that, as did Rosa Parks in 1955, Alabama, in her refusal to give up her seat on a bus, help inspire a civil rights movement, this can also do the same. And the reason I say that is that one of the things that people are complaining about is how can people put themselves and others at risk during a COVID pandemic, just in terms of health grounds. Well, I'd rather flip that observation on its head. To the contrary, it's because people do understand and get the injustice, the obscenity of racial prejudice, that they are prepared indeed to put themselves, their very lives, at greater risk by protesting about it, by vocalizing about it. And what exactly is that racism in British society, for example? Well, in 2005, we had somebody wrongly identified on the basis of race, as it happens, Jean-Charles de Menezes, shot down on the basis of a shoot to kill police command, which didn't enjoy public consent. Nobody knew about that. And the gold commander in that fatal shooting, Cressida Dick, is now the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, even though she herself had to face numerous investigations and her decisions were found wanting. For me, that's quite extraordinary. Not only that somebody was killed on the streets of London in that way, but that the gold commander was subsequently elevated to Metropolitan Police Commissioner. I would defy anybody to imagine that a black person who had been at the helm in that fatal shooting could have been elevated to Metropolitan Police Commissioner some decade or so later. So I do think there is structural institutional racism which needs to be addressed. And who has ownership of that problem? Ella, in her opening remarks, talked about white privilege. This is an element of the debate, I think, which really needs tackling. Who is allowed to vocalize, take ownership, and address the problem? Well, really, I think the answer is very simple. All of us. It's that simple. If we are part of the problem, whatever our skin color, if that is a major characteristic which is causing the problem, then we all need to be part of the solution. And what I don't want to see happening is a kind of exclusion of those who not just have their heart in the right place, but their head in the right place, who understand unconscious bias, who understand institutional racism, who campaign on it alongside everybody else. They need to be part of the debate. They are part of the solution. And we need to make sure that all of us, yes, in a kind of a color-blind fashion, are enabled and empowered to embrace the proposition which is structural and institutional prejudice. So let's not make or remind people about their race who stand alongside us as allies in trying to combat racial prejudice. We need those allies. Finally, in terms of the process, this can be quite destabilizing. And of course, there is a lot of disagreement thinking about demolition of the Colston statue, for example, around what are legitimate means in a democratic process. Well, I think it's always been the case when there's been momentum and a transformation of society, this has required people taking to the streets, vocalizing, mobilizing, and showing the urgency of change that they demand. It's not almost a protest, it's a demand. And symbolic as the demolition of a glorified statue of a slave trader may be, this can also help galvanize public opinion and popular opinion. And there may be legitimate disagreement about that. For sure, that is a process of the act of taking that statue down is an act of direct action. And I think what we need to be clear about is, where does the line begin and end, where direct action becomes violence? For example, I do not condone, in fact, I would condemn the throwing of projectiles, objects at police and at buildings. That's not direct action worthy of the name, because guess what? It's not intelligent. So direct action worthy of the name needs to be rational, intelligent, and yes, it may risk breaking law. It may actually, on paper, be criminalizable. But the police in Bristol that day, the superintendent we've heard from, allowed it to continue. And that again raises a question about double standards. Why are we allowing that to continue? Is it because the police in some sense were intimidated by the prospect of intervening? These are important, challenging, difficult questions to answer and address about the place of protest juxtaposed alongside the rule of law. But we do know and understand that often mass movements have had to resist and challenge current legal practices in order to overcome them and reform for the better. So
last point now, Shahrar.
I'm looking forward to the debate. I think there's plenty to discuss, and I hope also that we can reach not just accommodation, but a deeper understanding about the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Right, moving on now to Kunle, who should be unmuted.
It's good to be with you tonight to discuss this topic. Like many people who saw the graphic images of George Floyd being suffocated, quite compelling, and evoked a human response of revulsion and anger. The events that we've seen over the last week have clearly stemmed from that initial incident, but from what I have seen, I'm not completely convinced that it's about simply George Floyd. It seems to me that there was a rage and an anger which mixed with the notion of a pandemic, which has a disproportionate impact on people of BAME backgrounds, and the question of repression, and the, I suppose, the energy and frustration of young people, that this was more than just about what was happening in America. And certainly one of the things that has kind of vexed my thinking over the last 2 weeks has been to understand why it is that in this country we have a history of equally, if not even more, brutal deaths at the hands of police authorities. We have never seen the kind of reaction nationally in relation to those that we've had in relation to the events in America. Indeed, you know, you could talk about Mark Duggan in 2011 and the riots that followed. There were riots, but there were very little in the way of protests, in the way of actual arguments being advanced about wanting to transform society. And with that, it kind of moves me to my next point, which is the question of systemic racism, as it's being called. Quite interesting. I've never heard the term systemic racism being leveled so much as I have heard in the last 3 weeks. As a long-standing anti-racist myself, certainly the question of racism being systemic has always been at the heart of some of the issues that I've taken up over the years, particularly in relation to questions of immigration. And we were very clear in terms of my younger years that there was a distinction between racism on the one hand and prejudice, very careful not to muddle the two. And so the systemic nature of racism and its roots, its material roots in the way society was organized, was something that was strongly held and strongly felt. So when I hear people today talking about systemic racism, I wonder if we are actually talking about the same thing. Are we talking about systemic racism in terms of a system of oppression, or a system of oppression which is based on individual behavior, and therefore the solution to the problem of race is the regulation and control of individual behavior? So I'm just throwing that one out there. And the question really, I think, is at the heart, I think, of what needs to be discussed, and needs to be discussed honestly. Because society has made improvements in every era, and there have been improvements, even in race relations in this country. But from much of the commentary that I've heard, you would believe that actually nothing has changed in the last 400 years. And that can't possibly be the case. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that we are in a post-racial society, so don't caricature me or try to present that argument. What I am saying is that we have to understand those things that have changed and those things that remain the same. So for example, we know that in terms of the improvements in the educational performance of BME kids has been something that's been long admired and talked about. But what we haven't seen is the translation of that educational attainment and performance into an improvement in the job market in terms of the way that employment as opportunities has improved for those young people. So, you know, there are swings and roundabouts. And I think when we're looking at race, there's too much of a tendency to be, it's either one thing or the other. And we need to have, I think, a much more reasoned and measured debate about what's been going on. I'm just going to say briefly, touch briefly on the issue of the statues. As some of you know, I'm on the board of the English Heritage Trust, which looks after about 400 buildings and over 500,000 monuments and paintings across Britain. And they include places such as Stonehenge and Kenwood House in London. Now, I thought what was said by Patrick was interesting about history. And you talked about the nature of the relationship between Britain and slavery in America. Well, Patrick, just remember, Britain also gave America the Mansfield Judgment, the first recognition that a Black individual could not be actually forced into slavery in this country if they were exported from America. Indeed, the Mansfield Judgment is celebrated on the 22nd of June, the same day as Windrush Day. And that legal judgment lays the basis for changes in the American legal system that paved the way also towards changes in American legislature. So, you know, if we're going to talk about the relationship between Britain and America, let's not just concentrate on the negative stuff. Let's also remember I think there's a lot of good stuff that's come out of the UK in terms of race relations that, in fact, America has learned from and could still learn from. And one final thought would be,
very quickly, Kunle.
Is there anything now that we can actually learn from race relations in America that could apply to Britain? And I think that's something serious to think about.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Great opening thoughts. Right, now, last but not least, we have Dr. Cheryl Hudson.
So really agreed with lots of what Kunle just said, but I'm going to focus much more on the US context. That's what I know about. I have been fascinated with US history all my life. I am really intrigued by the founding ideals of liberty and equality, and the contradictions and the ironies within US history that emerge when you think about these things less as abstract ideals and more as kind of concrete lived realities for people. So the largest of those contradictions, of course, is race. African Americans so clearly have not and do not enjoy the same citizenship rights as other Americans. Historically, they've not been free, and there continues to be large racial disparities, so they aren't equal. So racial injustice, racial inequality, segregation and racism have been constant features of US history. But I want to echo what Kunle just said and say that this focus on continuity in race relations is, I think it really concerns me, because history is never just about the things that stay the same. There are always changes, and even if those changes aren't for the better, they need to be recognized, and we need to be alive to those changes if we really care about making the promise of freedom and equality real for all citizens. So when I was an undergraduate, I'm reading all about the US civil rights movement. I was very idealistic. I went to study in the University of Mississippi to find out about this history. And a few things happened when I was there that really kind of highlight some of the changes that have happened and that can help us to understand race relations today in America, and how the racial question has really changed. So the three things that happened there, and they all happened in 1992, so I think this is a really key year. 1992 was the year of the Rodney King riots. There was police brutality, which was being responded to, like as in the 1960s, but the people who were responding to it were not all African Americans. So the rioters, as in the 1960s, they'd been all African American in the urban centers. There were Hispanics, there were Asian, there were white rioters in 1992. So that was a shift. In 1992, there was also, the US Supreme Court handed down a decision on the Ayers case. And I came across this because I was on my way walking to the University of Mississippi for my class, and I saw outside the federal building a large group of African Americans protesting. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I'll go and find out what's happening over there. So I went and found the organizer and spoke to them. And they told me that this Ayers decision had just been handed down, which had said that the Mississippi higher education system was still segregated and it had to change. And this group of African-American, quite a large group of African-American students, were protesting in order to keep the three historically Black colleges open and alive for serving the Black community. And that just kind of struck me as, that's strange, because I thought the civil rights movement was about integrating everything, not keeping it separate. So that was another kind of shift I logged. And then the third thing in 1992 was that Bill Clinton was campaigning for president. And just before Super Tuesday, he posed outside, and I think, Ella, are you gonna put up the image that I have? So he posed outside of Stone Mountain, Georgia. And this was his kind of racist law and order bid for president. Okay, so if you're wondering about Trump's play on the law and order thing in the current situation, he got his script from Clinton, right? So Clinton was playing this race card. He was flanked by bigots on a street named after a KKK chief. and in front of a mountain that was created, or a carving in a mountain that was created to commemorate the Confederacy. So if you want your racist cultural symbolism, you have it in just bucket loads there. And of course, the result of Clinton's presidency was the crime bill, where he said 3 strikes and you're out, welfare reform, these things leading to mass incarceration, so that now a young African-American man is much more likely to be in prison than to be in college. So it made me see in 1992 that the US problem with race wasn't confined to the South, although it still is in the South, and it certainly wasn't confined to the 1960s, but it's taken a really different form in the postmodern era. And I think 1992 was a really key year in that shift. And today's riots are kind of a continuum of that, or the logical consequence. You know, there have been a lot of brave African Americans, people like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, who worked hard throughout US history to reconcile the promise of American freedom and equality with the reality of Black lives. So Martin Luther King pointed out that the founding fathers wrote a promissory note to future generations that turned out to be a bad check. And he said, it's time to cash that check in his big speech, right? So the difference today, though, and I think since around 1992, is that young people simply don't believe in the founding ideals anymore, those Enlightenment ideals of freedom and equality. Yes, I do think some of them are idealistic still, but many more of them are nihilistic, and they're searching for meaning. But not to mention that many of them also don't have a bank account to cash that check in. So this is, I think, a material economic concern as much as it is a symbolic cultural one. And the freedom and the equalities that America promised are still not being delivered to all of its citizens.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Cheryl, for your thoughts. Right, I said I was going to come out, but I've actually decided, having listened to our speakers, that I just want to ask 1 or 2 questions of the panel, just very briefly before we get stuck out. And that will give you guys in the audience a chance to get your hands up there, as I see some people are doing. Find that raise hand button and get it up. But Inaya and Patrick, really, if I come back to you, start with maybe with you, Patrick, and ask about this point that Kunle and Cheryl have brought up in terms of that history is both made out of an understanding of continuity, but also of change. And, you know, if you were going to take a critical view of Black Lives Matter, you'd say that they are posing a narrative that says that because of white privilege and white supremacy, there has only been continuity of racism, both in the US and in the UK, and that there hasn't been change. But how do you respond to that in terms of the kind of points that especially Kunle has raised with the idea being that any kind of movement for progressive change should recognize its victories as well as its shortcomings?
Sure, and that's the reason why I gave that narrative about Dame Jocelyn Barrow and others around the 1965 Act, around the Race Relations Act. That was the first piece of legislation which has influenced to all the equality legislation that would take to gain. So it's not like I'm saying that there's been this continuing racism, there's been no achievements. Of course there've been achievements, that's why we're here. That's why we've got probably more Black and minority MPs in Parliament, even though we haven't got enough senior Black people working at senior level in NHS, despite the fact that we've been there since the creation in 1948. So of course there's been change. And I know Kunle mentioned about the Mansfield legislation, and that was important as well. But that had more impact in the UK than the USA, to be quite honest, because it meant that if someone who was enslaved or the possession of a plantation owner and that person came to Britain, they weren't technically speaking still slave. Whereas in America, people were still enslaved. That's why we had underground movement. And unfortunately, we had to have the civil war between the North and the South. And that was one of the main reasons why we had the war, because of slavery. So let's be real about that. And often conflict does require violence. I'm not supporting violence, condoning violence. Interesting, Nelson Mandela, when he was released, and one reason why he stayed in prison for a long time, it was always asked by the apartheid regime, used to ask him, just sign along this dotted line and say that you will rescind all violence and terrorism. And he refused to do so. That's why he spent all that time robbing Ireland. And then when he came out and became president, he was interviewed by American journalists to say, why do you recognize Arafat, Castro? They're terrorists. And he turned around and he made this very powerful statement: who are your enemies? America was supporting apartheid. Britain was supporting apartheid, but particularly Cuba. If it wasn't for Cuba, who were able to mobilize nearly 100,000 troops to fight in Namibia and South Africa, I believe that apartheid will still be happening now today. So this is quite important, that when you look at history, let's put it in the context of reform, that's important, but there's also in terms of resistance. The reason why slavery ended was because of resistance of people fighting the Maroons, fighting the plantations in the Caribbean, in South America, and in North America as well.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And if I come to you, and I mean that point that Patrick raises, I mean, there's a quote by a video of James Baldwin that's been doing the rounds on social media, where he talks about the fact that, you know, you say that these things take time, where you've had my great-grandmother's time, my grandmother's time, my mother's time, how much time do you need? And there's that sense also of, within these protests today, that there's lots of, especially young people, just saying, I have had enough of this, and I'm not going to sit around and wait for us to have long discussions about reform. I want change now. How does that fit in? Does that have a place? How does it fit in with what you're arguing for, which is a much more formalized political discussion about policy change, or, you know, those kinds of things?
A few things that I would say. I think first, as I said, I do agree with a lot of that has been said, and I think it's really important that we are analysing the history and how we kind of got to this point. But I do think that we are being somewhat idealistic in terms of what the actual particular Black Lives Matter movement are. I think if we actually interrogate many of the demands that are being put forward, for example, in America, but to some extent here as well, I think many of these demands actually, for example, defunding the police and things like that, are actually legitimate things that are being called for and now being advocated for in many of the governors and the states. So I think that we can talk about kind of the history of race and how it plays into the dynamics of what is going on today. But I think that we also have to root our conversation in the present day and recognize that not all of the things that are emerging and coming out of these movements are actually fundamentally addressing the things that are being talked about. So the thing specifically that I will say is this notion of kind of systemic racism, and this idea that all racialized outcomes are automatically because of racism. And I think that this is actually a particular pernicious idea that needs to really genuinely be unpacked. So kind of bring it back to UK, for example, and as I've written about before, there are actually significant disparities in terms of, for example, educational attainment in regards to the different Black ethnic groups in Britain. So I think that when we kind of generalize this idea that that disparity is inherently to do with an external kind of systemic problem, rather than actually, I think there are persistent ongoing things within the Black community, or some sections like internalized racism that get projected outwards into the way in which many sections of the Black community might act in the world. I think that then we're missing those particular issues. So I think that ultimately it is important that, again, we are having these conversations, but I think we need to be quite frank and honest about the different narratives that are being played and how they're actually impacting the responses that we are getting.
Brilliant, thank you. Shahrar, come to you next. Because one of the things that you picked up on was this idea that we should be inclusive. And I don't know whether you were referencing the debate about white privilege there, but obviously the part of the difficult discussion around this particular moment of response to George Floyd's killing is that there has been, you know, what I tried to outline in my intro was that, you know, these protests that once feel kind of separate to the official line of Black Lives Matter, and there's a load of stuff going on. There's as many, for example, the one in Parliament Square, there was as many working class kids, black kids there as there were middle class kids with, you know, white silences, violence signs, and it was a whole mix of stuff. But the you know, the very strong line in all of this is a sense of victim politics, if you want to put it that way, which is that, you know, statues oppress me, inanimate objects, things, comments about my hair oppress me, rather than a focus on the, if you want to put it that way, structural racism, or the kind of material ways in which black people are oppressed. So is that something that can be ignored, or do you have to take the leap and say, actually, you're wrong in terms of putting it in this way, or maybe you think it's right? What do you think?
I think the answer to your question is partly around the complaints about so-called identity politics. And so let me address that, because it's also coming up in the chat as well. Some people are diagnosing the problem, I would say, as partially confected as a result of identity politics. I think that's a mistake, and that's badly overstating it, but let me try and explain why there might be something to it. Where I think identity politics in the pejorative sense does rear its ugly head is precisely in trying to disempower those who would seek the same goals as those who are trying to overcome racism would make, to try and say that, for example, because you don't share the characteristic by which you would have been unfairly disadvantaged in society, you have no right to speak out against it. That is so badly wrong. It is so disempowering. And most importantly, it's counterproductive, because just as there are two sides to any of these equations, there's the impotent, the powerless, and the ones who are doing the oppressing. It's those oppressed individuals who also belong to particular groups who may not be part of that characteristic, who are oppressed in the main, need to be part of that solution. So it's doubly important that we embrace and commend those who are joining in that collective struggle. As we've seen a very multiracial complexion to those marches, that's something which we should applaud and commend. What's right about the difference that you may see between different races is in their lived experience. And for sure, those who have lived through the practices and the oppression of racism, at whatever level, may have more to say and more insight into the matter. Let me just give you a small example, because it speaks to structural racism as well. Very
quickly, sorry, because I've overrun in terms of asking you questions, so very quickly.
Yeah, so I mean, many years ago, I rang up a recruiter and asked them, what do you actually mean by this encouragement of people from back and ethnic minorities? She goes, well, the person on the other end of the phone, oh, I shouldn't worry about that. We're not really going to do anything about it. But anyway, where would you like me to send the application to? So, you know, I gave her my name, and suddenly it's as if you could hear her voice drop, because she hadn't realized, because of my accent over the phone, that I might have been a target of this proactive policy. And so it just conceals the double standards and, if you like, the lip service that is paid towards initiatives, positive initiatives, which aren't acted on and have no intention of being so. And that is a kind of a structural racism just there.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, I've realised that, having promised to come out to the audience, I've decided to ask you all questions, which is not on. But to be fair, I am going to now just quickly ask for Kunle and Cheryl really the same question, which is, where do you see this going? Shah's just brought up the question of lip service, and if you were going to be if you were going to be uncharitable, you'd say that I have noticed lots of my white friends doing things which look like lip service, in terms of, you know, the black square that went out over social media. Lots of people criticized that for being kind of the music industry playing lip service to this debate, and, you know, people talking about buying from black businesses, but you have this kind of sense in the back of your head that they're just sort of waiting for this moment to fizzle out and we can get back to life as usual. Or is there something more transformative going on in these protests, they certainly feel different to 2011, for example. Kunle, your thoughts first? Brief.
Let's get one thing straight, and I'll be brief. The worst thing that could have happened in relation to this tragic incident is that there had been no reaction at all. That is the worst thing that could have happened. So Black Lives Matters, even with all its problems, actually, there's an element of it which is actually a positive development. What we have is a very confused political situation, and a situation which is people are coming into, which is very much an era of depoliticization. And for me, the question of, where does this take us? I think it takes us to a place where we have to disentangle a whole lot of mess and a lot of messy ideas and a lot of bad ideas, but a lot of very public-minded, spirited young people who are desperate for change. And in that sense, I think there's something to work with. So I'm going to leave it there.
Brilliant, thanks, Kunle. And really the same question to you, Cheryl.
Yeah, I don't know. I really think it's a mixed bag. Like the crowds, they're very youthful. They're very mixed in terms of black and white, male and female, and most of them are, protesting peacefully. I think there's a lot of understandable anger in the crowds, and there's a big dose, I think, of real disappointment and frustration at the failures of the populist left. We just had Bernie Sanders losing in the primaries. We've had Jeremy Corbyn over here losing in the election in December. And across Europe, leftist populism has kind of crashed and burned. So I think there's a lot of anger amongst young people in particular about the future and their inability to shape it. So it's, they don't have a leadership, they don't have goals, they're just kind of acting out. It's very performative. And, I want to encourage the idealism. I want to encourage the fact that they want to change the world. But I just think that there's a lot that's not positive about it, or at least that I don't feel is, or I feel pessimistic about where it's going to go. I just feel like it's going to fizzle out, just like a kind of a tantrum, and then it's going to go, and it's not going to actually affect or change much at all. I mean, it may make some changes, but yeah, I'm not fit. I keep trying to talk to myself out of the pessimism, and like Kunle said, it would have been worse if nothing happened. That at least the youth want to change the world, they want to make things better, but it just doesn't look like it's going in a positive direction.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl, for that honesty. Right, now I'm going to come out to the floor, and there's a lot of you, and what I'm going to do is take a good handful, maybe 7 or 8, and then come back to the panel for really brief comments, and they're all Battle of Ideas speakers, so they know how this runs in terms of not answering everything. So I'll first of all come to Elizabeth Cameron. Welcome.
Hi, Elizabeth Cameron. So I want to be able to say with what I say that I've been a long time, sort of 20 years trade unionist, so very much also informed by the employment situation. But also I've been somebody who's formed community groups, worked with ethnic minority populations as we are disadvantaged groups. And it's really a commentary about change, whether change has happened. And I did listen to what Inaya said. And I have to say that it's not that the middle-aged are bringing back an argument for something that never resolved. It's because it's almost gone round in a circle. It's been some sort of cycle where you've looked at policing, education, housing. The first people you would ask a group together today will come up with these same things of areas of inequality. So policing, education, lack of historical context to ourselves as Black people, education, not being employment, not being able to progress, in trade union movements, lack of progress, and an acceptance that once we sort of set up Black only groups, here, there, and everywhere that we've kind of solved the problem and unconscious bias will take care of it. What this, to go back to the question and directly answer it, what it has done is caused a focus that where people are decision makers in all of those areas, they can start to want to do something about it, and it is galvanizing action, but it takes the decision makers and the leadership of our country, as well as those who oppose it, to be able to move this on and make something out of it. Is for them to take those conversations and make them into policy and relook at why in 20 years we can see what was the sus law is now the gangs matrix. You know, nothing's really changed.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's great. And a good example of how I don't need you to just ask questions. Please make comments like that. And Elizabeth kept it nice and brief, which is perfect for our long list. So thank you. Next up, John Holbrook.
So I thought that those introductions were very interesting. And I very much agree with all those people who say it's important not to focus on continuity, because I do think that this era is very different from the era that went before, an era which I think probably ended about 20 years ago. But what I'm not clear on is what people are saying is the rupture that's happened. How would they describe it? In particular, do they go along with the narrative, today's narrative of anti-racism, which it seems to me nearly everybody does? People tend to just disagree with the extent to which they will embrace it. They don't really seem to have a clear way of critiquing it or breaking free from it. And I think it's important to ask, what is really going on with today's anti-racists? What are they after? I think what they're trying to do is challenge a society-agreed framework for resolving issues by replacing it with a framework that means you look at skin colour and race all the time. And I think there was a clear example of that this morning with Sadiq Khan announcing he was going to have a race or a diversity audit of London's statues and landmarks. Well, of course, we all know where that's going. He's going to discover that vast majority of statues are of white men. Ho, 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 who's surprised at that? And then he's going to say, right, well, we must have more black people because we must make the statues representative of London today. And of course, what he's doing is trashing the notion of merit. In other words, the idea that people are on statues for reasons of history or because of endeavour and so on and so forth goes out of the window. And more broadly, all of these racial audits work on the same basis. They mean that you don't take into account different cultures, different social norms, different individual effort, which was a point that Kunle made. You're not allowed to look at any of those issues today. The only thing that you can focus on, according to the race-baiting left, is race. And I think that the real tragedy is that whereas Martin Luther King dreamed of a society where people were judged on character and not the colour of their skin, nowadays the left are judging people on skin colour.
Okay, thank you, John. Luke next. Luke Gittos.
Thanks, Ella. Well, I totally agree with the point raised by Shahrar that we can't allow for those who share common aims and common outcomes or attempt at common outcomes to alienate themselves from one another. But my worry is that that's exactly what the Black Lives Matter narrative encourages. I think if you look at some of the founding texts, and I sort of want the panel's feedback on this, because I wonder whether each speaker has sort of underestimated the potential damage of adopting the Black Lives Matter narrative about how we live and how we should live. Because if you look at what these people are arguing, both on, you know, this portion of the left, typified, I think, by people like Robin DiAngelo and others, is that everyone should think of themselves racially. I mean, as John suggested, what we're encouraging a whole generation of young people to start from skin color and to say, what does your skin color tell you about your assumptions about the world, about the experiences that you've had of the world, and about how you should relate to one another? And I think that's an incredibly destructive way to proceed. And it's certainly a huge backward step. It certainly marks contemporary anti-racists out from the anti-racists of the past. John mentioned Martin Luther King, but if you look at James Baldwin, the whole generation of writers recognized that the point was to transcend individual race-based identity, and that was the eventual hope. That was the idea, the utopia. So I just wonder whether the panel has slightly underplayed the potential impact of encouraging a whole generation of people to think of themselves in racialized terms. And just to say, we should also recognize that the problem here is not the demonstrations themselves. I think that the content of those demos have been, as Ella suggested, a kind of mess of reacting against the lockdown, reacting against police authority in general, but then also a collapse of adult authority around the demonstrations. So we've seen, you know, the police completely unwilling actually to enforce the rule of law around these demonstrations. And also every single institution in the West falling in behind the Black Lives Matter narrative. There has been very little institutional or adult response which questions the founding narrative of Black Lives Matter. It's been an incredibly forceful and dominant and persuasive for a lot of our institutions. So isn't there a lot of, aren't some of the speakers actually underestimating the potential damage that this unquestioning acceptance of Black Lives Matters narrative is having on our young people? And isn't this actually going to end up being quite catastrophic for race relations in the long run?
And take Claire Fox next.
Thanks. That's really thought-provoking discussion. Just maybe following on from that, actually. Inaya actually made the point about racializing so many issues. And one of the things that I find frustrating is that, particularly at the moment, any issue you come up with, any discussion you have about social problems, economic problems, every problem has suddenly become racialized because now we have to adopt a particularly racialized narrative. And I think that is problematic because it means that you get into a muddle about what is racism and what is just a way of seeing everything through the prism of race. And, you know, that includes class and all the rest of it. But I actually wanted to ask a question about the racializing, divisive nature of the present discussion. You know, first of all, somebody talked about white allies. I mean, I don't want to be anyone's ally, and I don't want to consider myself through the prism of being white. I consider that I want to treat people and be treated as their equals. And I know that, you know, I've done a number of media issues, you know, discussions on this, and people will actually say, how dare that white woman white-splain this issue? You know, you're not entitled to do it. You must show suitable humility. What do you know? So first of all, there's a kind of a really essentializing aspect to that, isn't there, that effectively threatens people. And it effectively says, you know, that you have to have this kind of, you have to get permission to be allowed to speak, which doesn't seem to me to have any kind of a positive, universalizing aspect to fighting racism. But the other thing was, somebody said, well, you know, racism, anti-racism becomes box ticking. Somebody made that warning, and that's really true. That if you actually only have one narrative that you're allowed to embrace, which is a very particular identity politics version of anti-racism, then I'm not surprised, you know, when we heard about that phone call where they kind of say, oh, it's just box ticking. Because what happens is it's all done in bad faith. You know, people are kind of taking the knee, but because they're being told they have to take the knee. If every institution goes along with this, you're not fighting racism. You're basically just throwing everything into a racialized pot. And just finally, as part of that, somebody in the chat raised the issue, you know, who's afraid of Black Lives Matters? Well, of course, Black Lives Matters is just a phrase. Some of it's an organization. Some people are just saying Black Lives Matters, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say because Black Lives Matters. But when you get to a situation where if somebody else says all lives matters, that they lose their job. If you get to a situation where there's an atmosphere that people are frightened to query some of this narrative, they might be doing so sometimes with a backward prejudice. Some of them might be racist, but some of them might just be asking, what on earth is going to happen if we close down debate so that people feel that they have to say the right thing or they get direct? And there is a real McCarthyite atmosphere, and in particular a demand that only certain people are allowed to speak, and when you speak you only say the same thing. So I welcome this debate because it's much more open, but I do think that there is something frightening going on at the moment in terms of a dictatorship of what you're allowed to say about fighting racism, and that doesn't feel progressive to me at all.
Great, thank you, Claire. Panel, I'm going to keep going just for a few more and then I'll come back to you, but I'll give you fair warning. So now I'll go to Sham.
Can you see me?
Yes, hi Shamini.
Hi. Okay, there was just something that puzzled me about just the current protest and the reaction to it was a lot of people seem very optimistic about this protest and what they sort of think there's going to be really good outcomes from it. And it puzzled me because it's, you know, the demands are much more vague, as people have said, and much more confused, unlike protests in the past, which had real kind of demands. But it's also coming at a time when the economic situation is going to be worse after the lockdown than it was before. And if you think that a lot of the prejudice against the position of Black people is based on the position of Black people in society, where many are unemployed or on welfare or involved in drugs and crime, why is that going to get better if the economy is going to be so much worse? Why do people have such a hopeful view that things are going to change for the better?
Brilliant. Thank you, Shamini. Right, I'm going to come back up the list to Kerry Dingle now from World Right.
Hi. Thank you very much. Really fascinating introductions and insights. I have to say, and I found Inaya, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, this introduction really inspiring and so refreshing, because I do think we are doing young people a huge disservice by not being brutally honest with them. I'm 61 and remember protesting after the 1981 swamp in Brixton, after the shooting of Cherry Gross and murder of Cynthia Jarrett in Tottenham in 1983, and more specifically in 85, and in 1993, the horrific murder of Joy Gardner when she was asphyxiated with gaffer tape by the police. There we were a tiny minority, Black and white. We were thin on the ground. We were, outlawed, and it was very difficult to even hold a meeting, and never mind get a trade union or anyone else on your side. Now things are incontrovertibly different. I mean, I don't believe, and few nutters aside, that anybody thinks the murder of George Floyd is okay, any more than anyone in Britain thinks slavery was okay. And letting young people know that there is some sort of continuum, or that their lives are as blighted as George Floyd's family has been, is an outright lie. And I think we should be very, very honest. I don't see anything progressive in what we've seen in Britain in the last week. I really don't. I don't think we're telling young people the truth about history. We're not informing them of your CLR James or what Martin Luther King, as one of your speakers pointed out, got up to along with white people. We are allowing this to go unchallenged. And it seems to me that it is predominantly a desperate search for an injustice that they haven't actually experienced. And to say they have is a fib. And I meet it all the time with the young people I work with who think they have a lot in common with Meghan Markle, who's experienced this terrible racist Britain. So a princess, has had this appalling time. That's what we're talking about, a victim culture gone mad. And I really think we should be brutal, in your face, and risk being called out for it, because we will be, because you're not allowed to say that kind of thing. But otherwise, we're doing young people a huge disservice and lying to them.
Great, thank you, Kerry. I'll come to Noah Keat now, and then I'm going to come back to the panel in the order that they spoke. So, Patrick, I'll come to you first after Noah. Noah, your thoughts, please.
Hello there, good evening. I've enjoyed this evening the comparison between the UK and the USA and some of the speakers' discussions, and I wonder whether one of the differences between the countries is that America has a sort of more ambivalent or more sceptical approach towards big government, and you see that in their constitution with the Second Amendment giving them the right to bear arms, and that sort of ambivalence or an anathema towards big government is fraying some of the discussion over Black Lives Matter in terms of ideas of, defunding the priests, getting lots of traction in the USA and hardly any in the UK so far. Secondly, I wonder what the panel thought on the balance between, in terms of tackling racism, the balance between legislative changes and winning over hearts and minds of individuals, because while social media might be quite effective at showing the toppling of the statue that took place on Sunday, you know, I wonder whether it would get as much attention if there's, you know, a white paper published that was trying to tackle changes, and as that went through select committee hearings, I unfortunately don't think that would receive as much attention as the immediacy of a protest. And finally, I'm going to sort of present a bit more of a positive attitude towards a protest. Couldn't we see them as sort of a celebration of free will, and the idea that those protesting are simply against determinism, and the idea that your background shouldn't shape how successful you are or aren't in life? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noah. Right, Patrick, I'll come to you, and really just very brief sort of one point from each of you now on the panel, because I want to get through the list. So Patrick, fire away.
Okay, well, it's been a good debate, and I think what Claire said, that it's important to have debate. But the problem in this country, we don't have a debate. We give the impression that we're a democratic country and there's free debate. And often people say, if you talk about racism, we can't talk about racism. If you talk about racism, then you're just being politically correct. And the problem we need, you know, we've had one of the problems with this country is this country built its wealth on slavery. My ancestors and many ancestors on this chat were, you know, that what was built on the slave trade, and this country has never ever spoken in an open way about it. At least in America, they've talked about it, and they might disagree, but at least have a conversation. And this is important. We give this pristine image of Britain, it crossed between EastEnders and Brideshead Revisited, where we have this beautiful Britain of like TV programs like I'm the Midwife, and gives this impression that there's no racism in Britain, or it's not on the same level. Remember, Britain controlled 3/4 of the world, and it exported racism to places like America. America was built on racism, a violent history. First getting rid of the First Nation people, then the Africans were brought over. That's the history of America. But Britain's got similar history as well. And one of the key issues is we're not being upfront about it. We don't talk about it. We give this impression that we're very genteel. But if all the plantations were in Britain, in the West Country, we would know the true history. And it's a violent history, a history that we don't want to talk about. So this is quite important. And I think what's happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, and it is a movement, and there's different aspects of that movement. Some aspects of the movement focus on climate change, some talk about police brutality, but it's a wake-up call for this country. And Martin Luther King has been cited quite a few times. And to remember, in the last part of his life, his young life, by the way, he realized that race wasn't enough. It was race and class and imperialism. And that's maybe one of the reasons why he got assassinated, because he started to put the picture together around the political context of capitalism and racism combined, which I think is important. Race on its own is not sufficient. It's about the class system and the political system. And we have a meritocracy in Britain. So we have the likes of Boris Johnson condoning what happened in Bristol and talking about I'm listening, yet thousands of people from BME communities are dying of coronavirus, and the government has no plans, they don't care, there's no initiative, and when they decide to do something, it's half-baked. Mm-hmm. That's why people are angry and they're taken to the streets.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. And thanks for agreeing to be brief, because we've got a lot to get through. So, Inaya, floor is yours now.
I think that one of the reasons why a lot of what is going on does feel somewhat directionless is because I think, again, it's not recognizing that Britain today is a fundamentally different place. And as much as I recognize and deeply appreciate and want to understand these complexities of history, whether people like it or not, we can't change the past. And what I'd really like to see is a more positive, kind of future-oriented vision of what kind of society or what kind of specific things people would like to change. Because in reality, for the past year, I have actually seen a negative backwards turn in relation to race relations in this country, and not for the reasons that are being described in terms of Britain all of a sudden becoming an incredibly racist country, but because I've had you know, seen a rise in kind of white identity politics, people saying it's okay to be white in reaction because there've been this kind of over obsession with dividing people by race and not seeing people as individuals. And I've had, you know, people messaging me, you know, white people messaging me saying, oh, you know, what can I do to help you and things like that. And some of it is, you know, genuinely sincere and wanting to help, but it's this kind of response to what I've seen is the kind of identity politics movement, which refuses to recognize people as individuals. And I think it is taking a genuine step back. And I think we really, really need to call it out. It would be wrong to assume that all things that are being done or claimed to be done in the name of anti-racism or kind of progressive politics is inherently going to produce something automatically positive. And I think we have to be honest in calling that out. We have a very suffocating climate right now when it comes to free speech and thought. That, for me, in and of itself is an example of how, you know, that's a context that doesn't always necessarily produce the most kind of positive outcomes. A lot of what has been described to me, you know, as systemic racism and things like that, you know, from my perspective, are actually issues related to inequality more broadly affecting people from across races. And we've seen the kind of stagnant wages, living standards, and the kind of material lives of young people not being improved in the promise that has been said to them. So I think that there is just a mix of things that are being homogenized into this one narrative about racism, which I think, again, as I've already said, is doing a huge disservice. Now, in terms of, you know, it's up to the leadership to kind of respond to what has emerged. I think that that's very true. We do have a vacuum of leadership in this country, and it does feel like you know, people, particularly in the establishment, are on the back foot when it comes to these subjects, or even pandering to what I think is in some ways the lowest common denominator of it. You know, you saw police officers saying that they didn't really want to step in when things are when criminal damage is being enacted. And so ultimately what I'm saying is that I think I am quite pessimistic and concerned about this assumption that everything that is happening is the kind of continuation of a kind of progress and progressive politics, when actually on the ground, in terms of what we're seeing emerge from the narratives that are coming from this, are actually things that threaten to wind the clock back quite significantly.
Brilliant, thank you. Shahir, now your thoughts.
I'm just going to pick up on Claire's points. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, far away. Yes.
I'm just going to pick up predominantly on Claire's points, actually, because it felt like quite a lot of people that resonated with people in the audience. In terms, because I think I'm probably one of the first people to use the word ally in this debate. It feels like the complaint there is that it's a kind of a second-class advocate, and I certainly didn't mean it in that way. The analogy I might make, actually, is I would regard myself as a feminist. Does that necessarily mean I'm going to be at the forefront, or I've had the deepest experience of prejudice based on sex? No. And therefore, I might not be best placed to be at the forefront or at the helm. However, I can be an equal partner in that campaign. And I think we've got a very good word for people who are galvanizing against racism, and they're called anti-racists. And when I'm marching, campaigning with anti-racists, I don't categorize them as black or white anti-racists. I just see them as anti-racist. And I think the most important point here is absolutely the disgust, the torment, the pain and the anguish that we all feel and are horrified by in that particular brutal killing of a black man is not so much because he's black, although that does add to the gravity of the offense. It's because we identify with him as a human being. We can all identify with the thought of suffocation, that the pain just through our imagination and empathy. And ultimately it's that which gives rise to progress and unity. It's the human in us. And it is absolutely the case, you're right, that you don't have to be a fan of Jean-Paul Sartre to know that on different days of the week, different times of the day, we might be occupying different roles. You know, if you're a consultant in a medical ward, you're not a black consultant as such. You're just a doctor dutifully doing their job as any other health worker is. So it's absolutely right, I think, to question this attempt to homogenize people into a very reductive category. But at the same time, we mustn't lose the plot. It is the case that people are treated differentially on the basis of a circumstance of luck, and some might regard it as bad luck. That's the thing we need to cut through. Ultimately, I think even the goals and the aims of Black Lives Matters protesters and those who are writing the campaign slogans, they don't actually want to be treated anything other than equally. It may be that there are differences of opinion with respect to how much you should identify with your cultural heritage. But I think ultimately, the true goal is to be treated as an equal. And to answer another point, the main difference between this movement, I think, the reason it can cut through is to overcome denialism about the scale of the problem and the scale of the challenge. And it certainly needs all of us on board to tackle, once we've seen with a clear view what the scale of the problem is, to overcome it.
Brilliant, thank you. Kunle, you're up next for your brief thoughts.
I think what people have talked about is the destructive properties of the idea that we can overcome social problems through the regulation of individual behavior. And I would actually say that in terms of looking at in the race context, it's most clearly seen in the current discussion around people's attitudes to things like bending the knee. But it's also, I would add, it's not exclusive to the question of race. We see it in the debate around transgenderism. We see it in the discussions around the Me Too movement. So this notion of conformity is not distinct to race. That is a much bigger problem. What I would say is that we need to give people a bit more credit for common sense. Talking to Black working class people in Bristol today about the pulling down of the Colston statue, many of them are not stupid or daft. They're very clear that this is a con job, that the idea that pulling down statues somehow is a radical act that will transform their lives. They see it for what it is, a complete symbolic gesture, nothing more than that. And I think the question really is, how do we enable our young people to understand that actually racism is a material question and requires actual much deeper thought and a much deeper challenge to the establishment than what's being offered at the moment. In particular, somebody asked about whether that transformation can come through legislation. In the current context, I could only think that a new Race Relations Act would be a complete nightmare of epic proportions, and the type of stuff that Kerry was talking about, you could see that writ large, because the only form that a new legislation would take would be the kind of stuff that pretty much we've seen in relation to COVID and people and the way that people have actually been dictated to in terms of their movements and activities during an emergency period. My final thought is on the historical question. Let's be clear, we have a history that is both far and near. I know for a fact that Patrick, for example, was involved in the campaign around Clinton McKirby, a young Black man in Wolverhampton who was suffocated in a next shop in similar circumstances to George Floyd, which probably many young people will never have heard of, but actually happened here in this country. But then again, on the question of slavery, I'm sorry, I'm not buying it, Patrick. The majority of slaves in the order of things actually went to South America, not United States or the Caribbean. In fact, the number of slaves that went to Brazil alone could swallow the number of slaves from the US and the Caribbean whole. And what's interesting is we know very little about the slave experience and how that's been informed by the question of brutality and policing right up till today. So I think that we have to detach ourselves from some of these almost ancient narratives and look at what is new, what is contemporary in terms of this discussion around race. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kunle. And Cheryl, your thoughts, please.
So I'm really interested in these definitions of what is racism, what is anti-racism, coming up, and I think that what Kerry was describing about is really about a change in attitudes, and I think across in both America and Britain, there has been a real liberalisation of attitudes towards about race. So people are much more relaxed about the whole thing, right? But that doesn't mean to say that. I mean, there's a decline in prejudice. There's a decline in kind of racist attitudes, but that doesn't mean to say that systemic racism, which seems to be kind of poo-pooed at the moment, doesn't exist still. So historically, the way I think about it is that, you know, when Martin Luther King left the South after he'd got the Civil Rights Act passed, so all the segregation, the disenfranchisement in the South had been removed, and you know, he was very victorious after 1965. He went to the North. He went to Chicago, and he tried to start up an open house. He called for open housing, an open housing program. And he came up with, he was very surprised to come up, he thought this was just going to be like the South, you know, we'll kind of do our non-violent protests and we'll show that this can all be broken down. But there were vested interests that in the mortgage companies, in the city government, even in the federal government programs, in homeowners, you know, in so many different areas, that it was going to take a lot more in order to break down racial segregation in Chicago than it was to do that in Mississippi. And so I think the northern problem in the States was in the urban cities, and then then the riots kind of broke out because they, after Martin Luther King was shot, because there was so much anger about that, and the kind of the refusal of Americans to be able to confront deeper systemic problems of race. So that's the problem of racism, which continues, and segregation and urban poverty and all of the things that African Americans suffering from, including mass incarceration, which really need to be confronted and dealt with. But I think that the anti-racism of today is actually working to avoid confronting those things, right? So they're focusing on statues, they're focusing on cultural representations, they're focusing on getting a few kind of tokenistic people into high places or whatever. They're not dealing with the mass poverty, the unemployment, the incarceration, and the racial segregation, which is huge in the States. And I'm not saying Britain is like that at all, because it isn't. The US has a particular problem. But I want to say that anti-racism today is taken a form which is really about consolidating the moral authority of this kind of soft power cultural elites. And it is not about actually tackling racism that really does exist.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cheryl. Now, we were meant to be ending there, and that's what I told the speakers, that we'd be ending at 8:30, but I want to run on until 9 o'clock because there's a huge amount of people still with their hands up. But speakers, if you have to leave, I know that some of you, Shai, have been teaching all day, then that's fine, just let me know. But if you can stay on, that would be brilliant, because I'd like to come back to you after I've taken as many of these people with their hands up. So just flag it to me on the chat if you have to go, and that's absolutely fine because I've run on. So let's take these comments now. Please make them brief, and I will just cut you off if you start doing a speech, because we need to get through them. But one thing I'd like to see perhaps raised in this debate, just from my 2 cents, is that Patrick and others have raised the issue of class. And there's been a lot of dead Black leaders raised in the discussion, Martin Luther King and others. What about someone like Fred Hampton? You know, what about the idea of this turning into being broadened out into something that resembles a discussion about class politics in America as well as the UK? I mean, that's one of the things that those protests had going for them, was that, you know, I'm not very good at judging crowds, but I'd take a guess to say that they weren't stereotypical in terms of being dominated by university educated, to, you know, your stereotypical middle class kids. So does class play a role here, or is that kind of, again, harking back through history at things that have already been decided and failed? Kimberly, I'm going to come to you first. So over to you.
So first of all, I'm 34. I have 3 children, 2 teenagers, and I was born here. My parents are Jamaican. So first of all, I'm surprised at the amount of white people on this Zoom call. I'm going to be really honest with you. I was shocked when I logged on. So that's really interesting for me because it gives me a sense of, so white people do actually have an interest in this subject, and they do possibly want to see a change. For me, I've experienced racism from the day dot, from school. Right now with my children in school, I've seen it. It's a real lived experience for me. So the issue here is sometimes when I hear white people talk about racism, I feel like they don't understand. If I cut my hand, you can empathize with me because you see the blood, so you can empathize. But the pain, I feel it because it's my hand that was cut. So what I want to sort of highlight here is when we say to white people, you don't fully understand, it's not because we're discrediting your view, but what we're trying to say to you is you don't feel that same pain. When you walk in a shop, it's that unspoken racism. You can't put your finger on it, but that feeling is there. When your son goes to school and he's been treated unfairly because of the color of his skin, you can't prove it, but it's embedded in the educational system. So what I'm trying to highlight is to dismiss history is very it's not tackling the problem, because we're here today in 2020 because of history. So if you dismiss history, you're not understanding why we are here today. So for me, I think that history needs to be looked into. I think there needs to be more conversations like this because there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings. We need to have more conversations and have real change. I think that when we have Black movements, we need to include white people in the movements because we need both narratives. But I believe that white people just kind of need to understand the pain that is behind this. It's been going on all my life. I'm 34 and I know by the time I die, it's still not going to be fully changed.
Okay.
So that's my point. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Kimberly. That's great. I'm going to now, just because Vernon has to leave, he's got another Zoom call. I assume all the other speakers are staying on, so I'm just going to bring Patrick in quickly for some final comments because otherwise we won't hear from him again. So Patrick, take it away.
Yeah, just want to thank the organisers for organising this debate. I've been on lots of Zoom calls over the last few weeks and looking at a whole range of issues connected with mental health, coronavirus, Black identity, stuff like that. And I think we need to have more Zoom calls where a lot of people, and I know not everyone agrees with my viewpoints, but the whole idea is about the battle of ideas. It's about a dialogue and engagement. And we don't have enough of this engagement. And if we have more of it, then I think people might understand and appreciate more about the Black lived experience. We have 400 years of oppression, but white people, I'm telling you, you don't understand it. You might think you do. You might give the impression that you might see superficial aspects of that, but you don't understand it. You know, and the reason why you don't understand it, as in a seminal book written by Paul Gilroy, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. Can I recommend anyone to read that? And the reason why he wrote that book and the reason why I use that expression is because actually Black people have made the Union Jack through blood, sweat and tears of 400 years. I have to keep on emphasizing that, you know, because people always say, what's this history got to do with it? We're in 2020, why are you harping about the past? But this country spends more of its time talking about the past. When we start to talk about articulate our past, we are shut down and completely ignored. And one of the key fault lines in history and fault lines in race in Britain is a lot of white people don't want to talk about issues around race because they feel uncomfortable. And so therefore we need to have more spaces like this to talk about this issue. But when a Black person talks about their lived experience of race and discrimination, take it seriously. Don't just poo-poo it and ignore it. Because that, for someone to share that experience, to articulate it on a Zoom call or at an event or whatever fora, it's hard work. Every day we have to live this. And if you were to have 10% of our lived experience and appreciate that, then I think Britain would be a better place. So I think it's about having more dialogue, more debate, and yes, it's all about context. I'm sorry. The context influences where we are now, influences all the stuff that we're doing around social policy change. And if we want to have real democratic change, and I think some of the points that have been made that about the whole stuff around anti-racism is quite interesting. We've had histories of anti-racism movements. During the 1930s, when Oswald Mosley in East London were attacking Jewish people, there was anti-racism movement then. There was anti-racism movement in the 60s, as I mentioned. The likes of Baroness Barrow was involved. We had anti-racist movements around Rock Against Racism when Eric Clapton was identifying himself with Hitler and fascism, and that's why Rock Against Racism. In the 80s, we had the same thing, and now Black Lives Matter is a continuum of anti-racist struggle. But this time now, Black people are taking the lead, and we want your support. And the word of alliances or legion is important. It's about supporting that as well. And I think that's very important. So enjoy the rest of the evening, and hopefully we'll have more battles and more dialogue.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for your thoughts. And let's fingers crossed that the next time we have a big battle, it will actually be in person rather than on Zoom. So you will, of course, be there. Patrick has spoken at our festival for years. So thank you for your time tonight, Patrick, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Right, I'm going to Zoom through the rest of you guys now. And really, I'm talking about a minute each. So I'm going to start with someone who has a 0 in their name, Osakoya. If you... Far away.
It's actually Kevin.
Oh, it's Kevin. Go ahead, Kevin.
My work computer. My very basic point is that there is a real different experience between race in the UK and race in the United States, and this isn't really appreciated. So the United States is above all segregated by almost any measure you can look, and there's extreme segregation in the United States in terms of residential neighborhoods, in terms of wealth and income. In terms of basically, you know, even the chances of getting married to a person of, if you are Black, getting married to a white person are very, very low, 12% for males, 6% for females. In London, if you're a Black male, you're more likely to marry a white woman if you get married. So there's not the same segregation here. And I wish people would not sort of talk about it in these international terms as if there's some sort of international racial experience and international whiteness. And very quickly, as a historian, please shut up about history, because I don't think that the history is that particularly relevant, particularly if you talk about slavery. If you take somebody coming from an African background, walking down the street in Minneapolis, they're not going to talk about it, you know, they're not going to have a different experience. The United States is a racialized place, and you will be judged for your skin color, not for the background and what happened to your ancestors.
Thank you, Kevin. Right, Toby Marshall up next.
I just wanted to ask the panelists, do you think one element of this is there's a strong element of government bedwetting here? I mean, we had 137,000 people protesting to protest. Sadly, 62 officers hurt. That seems like quite a peaceable set of demonstrations, and yet we've had a massively disproportionate reaction to that.
Brilliant, thank you, Toby. Nice and short. Right, I'm going to now go to Ramaisa Khan.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say, as a young person myself, I think that when you were saying at the start how no reaction is the worst thing that could happen, I think that's wrong. I think that actually making a mockery of the incident and just blindly following Black Lives Matter trend is becoming a hashtag now, and people are just forced to comply and post a black square. Otherwise, you're racist if you don't post a black square, and we're constantly being questioned and pressurized into thinking that you have to say something, otherwise you're slandered immediately. I think it's important to encourage people to use your platform, yes, and use your voice to express that racism is a massive issue at the moment. I feel like educating young people on the deep-rooted argument that institutional racism still exists and is camouflaged in our justice system is effective, and not just posting something for on social media just for the sake of it, and jumping on a bandwagon is less effective.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for those comments. Nancy McDermott now.
See it, there are three things going on that make this difficult. The first is the ongoing struggle of Black Americans to just become Americans, not Black Americans, the way that that's expressing itself in terms of individualism, in terms of feelings and political correctness. But the most important thing, and the thing that I think is driving this, and we need to recognize this, is the moral collapse of the American elite. And that, not the racial experience in the US and the UK, that is not what is in common here. What is in common here is the moral collapse of the elite, which is why in the United States, this has become a new religion with these weird self-abasing, pious reactions of bowing down, of washing feet, of people prostrating themselves, and it's created a seriously frightening mood of conformity where if you are seen, and I'm not kidding, if you were to stick your head above the parapet and question any of these things, then you can lose your job, you can lose your livelihood, and that's really important because we cannot understand why the police are acting the way that they are, why things have not improved for Black Americans if we cannot interrogate this problem properly.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to go to Ike now.
Hello, thanks for a great discussion. Just very briefly, I'm 43. I grew up in a neighborhood in East London in the 80s and 90s, and I'm almost ashamed. Not really, but I don't feel like a victim. I don't feel oppressed, and I feel as free as anybody else on this panel. Now, I know that experience. Obviously, I know racism exists. It's not everybody's lived experience. That is down to my character and my color. Now, my question for the panel is: what can Black people do as individuals, or as I hate this word, but I say it, or as a community, to empower ourselves and take responsibility for our own actions and futures, rather than waiting for an allegedly oppressive external white establishment to do it for us?
Thank you very much, Ike. Right, I'm going to go to Martin Earnshaw now.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. I'll just try one, which is to do with, I'm just wondering, first of all, why is it that the debate over here has been so informed by the American experience? It seems that the whole discussion about race has been wholesale imported from America. For example, hardly anybody talked about slavery 20 years ago, when I studied racism at college. It was addressed purely to British problems. So, I mean, and also you've got the Confederate statues debate being discussed, transposed into a statues debate over here. You've had protests saying that people are being killed by the police, which factually isn't true over here. And so it does seem that, although somebody said that there weren't many middle class students marching, it's mostly a working class crowd, it does seem that a lot of Black people have still internalized this university American derived discourse. Just wondering why people on the panel think that is.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin. Now I will go to Jackie.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm 46 years old, and I have Jamaican parents, and I was born in this country, but I actually grew up in the United States. So I have a kind of unique vantage point of being able to understand kind of the Black experience on both sides. And I wanted to kind of comment to the gentleman who spoke before the last one. Apologies, I don't remember his name. But he asked a very good question about what Black people can do within their communities to help themselves. I'm not sure that that's something that even can be addressed fully here, because I think that's an incredibly loaded question. I think that I want to respond to that quickly by saying two things. Firstly, I'll go as quickly as I can. Firstly, I just want to say that I personally believe that the response to what's happening in terms of this explosion of awareness about racism, what Black people really need to be doing is firstly examining ourselves about how we can heal and address the issues that we have faced systematically over the years amongst ourselves. I don't think that the answer is predominantly having a conversation with white people. I think the information, because of the internet and because of you know, the smallness of the world now through social media and access to information, is so much wider now than ever before. When I grew up in America, the educational system was very selective about what we learned, and it very deliberately, now that I understand in retrospect, whitewashed certain aspects of education. So there's so much about Black history and the contribution of Black people to history overall that was excised from education. Now we can access that, right? So, and this information is accessible to everybody. So I don't think it's really about excessive debate with white people. I think white people should get access to information and learn. There's so much there to learn about what it is to be Black and the experience of being Black on both sides of the Atlantic. But I do think the gentleman also raised a very fair point earlier about work we have to do within us. If indeed we have been systematically oppressed, if indeed that we have, he referred to it as alleged oppression. I don't personally feel oppressed as a person because I refuse to be shackled in that lies. However, that oppression exists, whether I feel it or want to acknowledge it or not, because there are too much statistical evidence that indicates that it does. However, it's about an individual mindset at the end of the day. And I think Black people, we have to educate ourselves on our history. We have to educate ourselves on what we can do to fix ourselves. And I just want to address the issue of...
I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there in the fairness of time.
I've said what I mostly want to say anyway.
Perfect.
So thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Sorry to be rude and cut you
off.
No
worries.
I'm going to take two more. First of all, Alan Miller, and then one more, and then I'm coming back to the panel. So Alan.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think the impulse to actually go and do something can be a very positive one. And the fact that so many people were outraged, I would say, is a positive thing. And the fact that actually change only ever happens really when ordinary people go out and impose it. But what kind of change is it, and what ideas inform that? And I think that there's a big problem and challenge right now that if we believe that everyone is a certain way because of their pigmentation, then your belief in freedom and the potential for solidarity and certain interests get pushed to one side. And what you end up doing is having a situation where if you can't build true solidarity and unity and convince the majority of people in society, which is how our freedom works and how democracy and a universal sense of justice can prevail, then we've got a real problem. I actually think it's possible to win over people to ideas, to convince them out of bad ideas, but to do that, you need to debate with one another. And I'm very concerned at the moment that many people are scared to say certain things. And I think that if we believe in freedom and justice and equality, we have to raise a flag for the idea that we can build solidarity, we can talk about interests and collective interests, but also we have to be able to argue openly and honestly without just calling people names and shutting them down. And I think that's where the current moment is tricky. I think it takes a lot of courage to do that. But in the spirit of fighting for freedom, that's really what our aspirations should be for everyone. And there's a massive distinction. I've lived in America for 15 years, as well as in the UK. And everything from interracial marriages not really being existing there, to how the police are an armoured invasion force in many cities, and the war on drugs and how it plays out differently there and here. There's a range of issues that can be tackled, but we have to be able to call things by what they are in a spirit of openness and freedom.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. Right, I'm going to take Fallon Glenn, Emma Gilland, and then that's it. I'm really sorry to everyone else who's been waiting. So Fallon.
So there's been lots of talk about why we haven't seen much progress. And I think if you want identity politics is what you're going to get. So just picking up on people talking about all lives matter, I think that we are seeing a lot of people having a very emotional knee-jerk reaction to Black Lives Matter. And that's because for many people, this narrative that we're being forced to believe just doesn't ring true to us. We see that ethnic minorities in Britain and the States, but we're talking about Britain, so for our context, they can get ahead, they can occupy spaces in government, they can occupy spaces in media, they can occupy spaces in film, they can do well. And actually we are seeing a decline in the widening gap of poverty for white people. We're seeing a decline in the educational attainment of white working class boys. We're seeing more white people dying in police custody than black people. I'm not saying this to center white people in the argument, but this is going to breed resentment. And I think I've heard people tonight reference CLR James. I've heard people tonight reference Martin Luther King and not yet Malcolm X, and maybe more recently Adolf Reed. Ultimately, the rights of poor black people and the rights of poor white people look exactly the same in the only place that it matters, and that is the ballot box. So why are we continuously hell-bent on dividing two groups that are natural allies? The only way we are going to fix this, it's not from a few middle-class white people piggybacking onto a movement because it's fashionable, because if they don't piggyback onto that movement, they're going to lose business. That's not brave. What we need to be doing is uniting people who are oppressed, not dividing them. It's the only way we'll see change. I want to know what the panel thinks about that.
Thank you, Felarin and Emma.
Yeah, so basically I think that, I know Patrick's not here right now, but he seemed to focus a lot on the history of like the black slavery in America, and I think that although it is a very important thing to understand, that we need to that the focus on these separate issues with the white privilege, and how there was another comment about how white people can't feel the pain, and I think that is true, and like I know that that is true, but I think that this is actually quite a negative focus, because we should be focusing more on what has been done in the past by black and white activists together to make the changes that have been made, and focus more on the common culture, because I think in the end this is going to be what is effective in bringing it together, and otherwise we're just going to keep almost putting people against each other. Yeah, I think isn't that more effective to work together to change it and focus on the changes that's been made together.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma, very much. And thanks to everyone, and massive apologies for people who haven't been taken. I just have to stop, otherwise it could go on all night. So I'm going to now come back to the panel for really brief comments. Shah, here, I'll start off with you.
Look, I mean, there's been a lot of interesting debate, discussion, and in the chat as well. The one I'd like to pick up on really is the level of oppression, which I think must not go understated, that BME people as a class, irrespective of the fact whether they want to see themselves that way, face continually. And I think one of the great topics in the chat is to do with empathy. And what would be good to reflect on is really the extent to which somebody who isn't a member of that class, because they don't have that characteristic by accident, can actually experience, live, and empathize with that oppression to the extent required to be able to campaign against it. I believe they can. They don't have to have that characteristic, just as I don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. However, it's also the case that we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. It is the case that lived experience is going to be fundamental to understand the scale of the challenge. And I have to disagree, since Felarin put the challenge out there, I don't disagree with everything that you've said, but I think it is a matter of degree and the scale of the challenge. I do feel as though, whilst you might feel as though there's not enough room, whilst you might feel as if the debate is somewhat suffocating for you personally, I do suspect that the scale of the challenge and the scale of the discrimination and the lack of opportunity that people have to face daily isn't fully acknowledged and understood by enough people, and those people with the power to do something about it. Finally, if I may, when I regularly, and I get accused of sounding like a lawyer when I do this, rail against police injustice, whether to myself or others, it's almost not because I can't withstand it. I see myself as somewhat integrated, intellectual, able to argue my case. But I'm always constantly thinking about those individuals who may be classified like me, who aren't able to argue their case. Whether it's 6 immigration officers, 2 police officers I was assailed by as I was entering the country once from a train on Waterloo International. They wanted, apparently my British passport wasn't good enough. They wanted to know whether I'd be prepared to sign documentation under the Immigration Act. Would I like to see a copy? Yes. I went through it painstakingly, hour after hour, until I won the day, because I wasn't going to submit to their arbitrary treatment for what I understood to be simply on the basis of my race. So that is what people are having to contend with. And yes, I think there may be an element in which it's being pushed hard, but that's because there's momentum behind this campaign. And it simply is because we cannot withstand the sight that we could be like that black man, even though we're not black. And I think that's the unifying force behind this campaign, which could be transformative.
Thank you very much, Shahrar. Now I'll move on to Inaya for her last comments.
You know, I want many of the same things that has been described. You know, I want progress. I want people's material lives, regardless of their race, to improve. And that's why, you know, a lot of what I have focused on has been kind of more interrogating the ideas behind the Black Lives Matter movement and where that is directed at, because I genuinely think that if that is not interrogated and if we do not call it out, regardless of who we are or what our race is, and that we're in danger of kind of producing something pretty negative. What I actually think is that many of the issues that have been described that are facing disproportionately affecting Black people, I do think are, you know, twofold. I think many of them, again, are actually things that are affecting people, poor people, regardless of their race. And I think that there is, you know, a genuine issue of a kind of very stagnant economic situation that is being felt by a lot of different people. But also, I think the dominant, you know, in my opinion, and, you know, we can debate this in another time, obviously, but I think the dominant issues that are actually plaguing the Black community specifically are actually internal and within the Black community, not necessarily predominantly external. I think that there are still a lot of kind of defeatist, internalized racism and victim narratives that do genuinely hold people back. And I think a lot of home truths just do need to be spoken about. And I think it's very easy to project an all-encompassing narrative externally without deeply looking at the issues that are kind of binding people down. And I think, again, this, you know, repetition of 400 years of slavery, I don't think anybody denies that. You know, no one denies that. It is about how do we understand history and you know, how do we move on in terms of creating a better future. And I think this continual reiteration as if Black people must be bound by this particular kind of oppressive narrative of history is a deeply destructive one, and I've seen it play out. And so the other thing I want to say is that I agree that you cannot understand or empathize because you're a white person. You know, some of the most productive and meaningful conversations I've had about race have been with white people. And I think that, again, we have to re-emphasize this universalist, humanistic notion, because the experience of being Black is different for different Black people. You know, people have described this experience of feeling racism every single day. That's not what I've experienced. You know, that people might say, well, that's my perception, is different. Well, we have to look at that. And so ultimately, I think that, you know, we really, really, really need to, again, continually have these important conversations, but actually be a lot more franker and a lot more specific, because so far what has mainly been said is very vague in terms of fighting systemic injustice, fighting systemic racism. What are the specific things that are the problem? What are the specific solutions that are being proposed? And let's debate them and let's interrogate them instead of this very homogenous narrative, which I think is deeply divisive.
Thank you very much, Inaya. I'm going to take Dr. Cheryl Hudson next. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
I think that, so I think the point I want to end on, there's so much to say. This has just been a really great discussion, and I think that it's just really useful to have all of these points out there, and you can see how many different perspectives people are coming from. I mean, I will tell you that I was told that as a white person, I shouldn't be speaking publicly in this debate, that I shouldn't participate. I was warned off participating in it. I'm so glad that I have participated, because I found it's been really useful. But when I lived in Mississippi in the 1990s, I had a truck of white rednecks kind of pull up onto my lawn, shining their headlights in the window, holding their shotguns and telling me, that I needed to keep away from black people, and that I needed to stop being involved in anti-racist work, that I need to keep my mouth shut. This was in the early 1990s in Mississippi. In 2020 in Britain, I get a nice polite email from a colleague telling me that I shouldn't, as a white person, be speaking at this moment because it's not my place. So they kind of felt a little bit the same to me, in the sense that it was, both of them were white people telling me not to speak up on racial justice. And I just feel like everybody should be speaking about this. Everybody can speak about it. Everybody has something to contribute to the discussion. It's something that's I have studied and looked at and worked and been an activist in my entire life. So I've just been watching recently the documentary Eyes on the Prize with my son, and one of the civil rights workers from the beginning of that discussion said that the denial of anyone's freedom is the denial of my freedom. So Black people and white people, I think, do need to unite against racism, but also to understand what racism actually is. And I think that this is the most important reason for this discussion, is to find out what is effective in challenging racism, because I don't think that the current form of anti-racism is very effective at all, because it just deals with symbolism and gestures. Somebody said, I think it was Nancy, said that it kind of represents the moral collapse of the elite. I don't think it's that. I think it's actually the consolidation of the moral authority of a new elite, a rising elite, who have kind of a cultural soft power and who are using this kind of anti-racist narrative to impose and control people's behavior and tell them how to think and to be, you know. And yeah, we all need to speak out and speak our minds, and you know, free speech. I think free speech is a really important issue in the anti-racist struggle, actually. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you, Cheryl. And last but not least, Kunle, your final thoughts.
Well, there's so much there, but I think, I mean, two things. In terms of history, I got asked last night by the Mayor of London to join the new commission that's been set up around monuments for London, and which I thought was funny. He obviously didn't really understand where I was coming from, just thought, well, I've got some interest in heritage. But what was interesting is today he's gone out and said that the Tate buildings need to change their names. The interesting thing, and this is the only reference that I'll make to ancient history, is that of course the Tate and Lyle family involved in the sugar industry were not involved in slavery. In fact, they set up their operation around about 1850 after slavery had been abolished. But the myth that somehow Tate and Lyle and the Tate family, who donated all these magnificent libraries and buildings to the working class for self-improvement, are now villains of the peace, shows you that even the Mayor of London needs a political and historical education. And that's all I'll say on that. My final point really is about the question of honesty. I think there's a lot of dishonesty in this discussion about race, which has been carried by both the media, in academia, and even to a certain extent by a kind of paucity of a Black political leadership. I say that for two reasons. If we really believe that racism has become a major problem, and it's a problem of white people, then why is it that in the media and in discussions, there aren't more white people actually being invited in to discuss it? That's the first thing. So that's the first dishonesty. In terms of the question of lived experience, I mean, Baljit Sandhu, the guy who's one of the main theorists behind lived experience that's been picked up by loads of institutions, I spoke to him the other day, and he absolutely decries the way that people have now engaged in this notion of lived experience. And he said to me that he wishes that he'd never actually even put it forward. But, you know, that's for you to go and read up and ponder. But I think the final thing is, in terms of, for me as a Black person, the final dishonesty is the fact that there isn't a Black leadership at the moment that has the critical faculties to really cut through some of the crap that's been pushed. And I think that, you know, where are the Bernie Grants? Where are the Malcolm X's? Where are the kind of figures in terms of being able to take a really serious lens to society and be able to unpick some of the things that people have talked about? So I think my final plea, really, in terms of summing up, really is a plea for honesty and a fearlessness that needs to be had out in terms of we need to go where the arguments take us, even if it makes us feel uncomfortable, even if it means that we're unpopular. And I hope that, you know, some of you involved in this discussion tonight will take on board some of what's been said and go out there and really make that challenge. I'll leave it there.
Please thank our speakers. Everyone who's joined.
Things should be taken down, but with that,
and for all of your time, because I realise that it's now gone well over 2 hours. But I think, you know, Cheryl mentioned that someone told her not to do this debate. We'd be lying if we said we weren't, you know, slightly nervous or feeling cautious about this debate because of the tensions around it. But my God, I'm glad we did it. And this is what the Academy of Ideas does. We have the difficult debates. We have the ones that people disagree over, and we genuinely pride ourselves in providing an open public forum for us to hash out these kind of ideas. And like I said, it doesn't work without you in the audience giving your comments, but it also doesn't work in this period without your support, financial support, if you can. So please head to www.academyofideas.org.uk/donate. Small or big, you know, whatever, it really helps us to keep this going. We were not going to solve this debate in 2 hours or 7 hours. It continues. And so I urge you to check out the website, academyofideas.org.uk, and just find out what other debates we've got on. We've got one coming up on the NHS in relation to coronavirus. Remember that, you know, pandemic happening. There's so much going on in politics right now. And we've got a wide spread of events, book clubs, salons, regional salons, a forum this week on the economy, on oil, you know, lots of different issues. They're all free to attend, and we would really love as many of you to be there as possible. You know, we want to get back to those physical events where we can, you know, safely brush up against each other in terms of the debate, but also this period of time in the land of Zoom means that we can all get together internationally and across the UK. So let's make the most of it. Join up, sign up to our newsletter, and if you can, make a donation. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the speakers, Patrick, Shahar, Inaya, Cheryl, Kunle. You really gave some enlightening introductions and comments throughout that to help us. And thank you to the audience for being so honest, as Kunle says, actually. This is going to be recorded. Please, when it goes up on social media, share it around with your friends. Perhaps you can kick off another 2-hour discussion if you like about it. But let's keep talking about this. Stay in touch with us, and I'm sure you'll hear from us again soon. So I'm going to leave this open for until about 9:30 in case anyone would like to chat or continue the conversation more. But thank you from me, everyone, and good night.